Hey everyone, this is Mitch. This is part one of a video series I'll be doing on my process for taking high poly meshes, creating low poly meshes, and then baking the high poly meshes onto the low poly meshes to generate textures that you can then use in Substance Painter and put in the game. So this first part is just going to be me covering my process for modeling low poly meshes around high poly meshes, just some of the tips and tricks that I use. So let's get started. So I'm going to start by placing my cursor on the surface of this high poly mesh. Now you need to make sure that you have face snapping enabled and you've got project individual elements onto the surface of other objects. So I'll make a plane and we'll delete almost all of it, just retain one vertex. Going to top view here, I'll move this vertex over onto an edge of a surface that is pretty well defined. So there it is, aligned with the edge of the supercharger, and I'm just going to go into the side view and start really loosely tracing the profile of this high poly mesh. You don't really have to worry about accuracy too much yet because I'll come back and adjust that much later. But first I just want to start by tracing the outline all the way around, and there we have it. We can fill this shape in and then extrude it along the length of this first part of the supercharger. And that's basically good enough for a low poly mesh. So some of the requirements I just want to talk about are you don't want to have the high poly mesh penetrating through the surface of the low poly mesh too much. You can get away with a tiny little bit because we are going to be using a cage for baking. And the cage is displaced by about 1 millimeter from the surface. So in this case, the cage would actually engulf this lettering that's poking through the surface, and that's not going to be a problem. I'll just continue modeling, and I'll speed up this part a bit on screen so you don't have to sit through the whole thing. Okay, I'm back again, and I've finished modeling low poly mesh engulfing most of this object. I've just got to the end here, adjacent to the pulley, and this is a little bit more complex. So I have to decide how to model a mesh that engulfs this area of the high poly without using too much geometry. So I'll start by adding a plane and just shrinking it down. I might just get rid of those two vertices, and then snap these ones onto the surface, extrude them downwards. And the good thing about this area is that it is symmetrical around a pivot point, so you do have 6-way symmetry, so we'll be able to rotate one of these segments once it's done. Now I'm not following the mesh exactly. I'm letting the low poly mesh spread out a little bit and fill over some of these cavities, because we don't need to worry too much about the exact geometry. It's more about the profile, more about the silhouette of the object. So as long as the silhouette is similar, then what goes on in the little cavities and cracks and nooks is not super important. Okay, so I'll extrude these vertices out to the end, and these ones, and then start filling in the faces, just making sure that it is encompassing the original mesh and nothing's really clipping through too much. Okay, now go back to the original mesh, set my cursor to the center point of that radius. Now setting the transform center to the 3D cursor, copy this, rotate it around by 60 degrees because we have 6 of these fins protruding. And now I need to fix these intersecting vertices by merging them. And that should now be a piece of geometry that I can copy around again. So 60 degrees, 60, 60, and 60. And I'll just get rid of the original one because that's probably not going to match up. And copy the final one around by 60, and we have a nice closed mesh. And I'll just remove any doubles by distance to make sure that that's clean. I've been doing that everywhere, by the way, so so here you can see that instead of just letting this this face exist as a single face, as a massive n-gon, I've actually deleted it and then filled this geometry between this surface here and this surface here. And that's so that we don't waste any texture space on the interior, because obviously that's not going to be visible. I've done the same thing back here, and just as an example of some of the shortcuts I've taken to make sure that this mesh is closed and neat, I have filled in, I've effectively joined these details on the original mesh in the low poly, so that there's no gap between them, and that's fine because the gap will still appear in the baked textures once they are created. So once more, we'll get to the center point of the circle, create a new circle. I've just given it 10 edges because I think that'll be enough for the silhouette to look convincing. Delete that face, and we'll just select the edge loop here and the edge loop there and fill them. And I'll do the same thing back here. Delete that face, select the edge loop, select the edge loop, just make sure I didn't accidentally get extra stuff, and then fill it. And now we just go to face orientation and just make sure that everything is facing in the correct way. So we'll recalculate outside, and because it should be a closed mesh, almost a closed mesh, it just looks like there's a rogue face, a rogue interior face, which I'll have to hunt down and kill. There we go. I need to reselect that edge loop and fill it. There, that's much better. So now everything is a totally closed mesh, and there's only minimal clipping, which we'll just sort out really briefly. These faces these edges can come up a little bit, and this one can slide over. And it looks like these ones need to come out just a little bit as well. And we don't want that lettering to be clipping through. In fact, I think that we need an extra face there just to make it a little more form-fitting. And I'll just clean up those accidental faces created by the bevel operation. And there we have it. A nicely closed mesh with... Oh, well, I thought we were done. We've actually got a little bit more clipping to take care of. You just have to be really diligent in getting rid of these issues because they will annoy you later. you'll do a nice long normal map bake, and you'll get to the end of it and find little patches of wrong color where these things have been poking through. So yeah. There's one more thing I wanted to cover before we start UV unwrapping, and that is properly shading the low poly mesh. So right now everything's just flat shaded. If we go object shade smooth, then it's smooth, but it looks terrible. There's no definition in any of the corners or the creases. So to sort that out, we need to go to the Object Data Properties panel and check Auto Smooth and set that to 180, and that just means you won't get sharp edges automatically generated anywhere. The sharp edges will only be defined by the edges that you manually set as sharp. So we need to select edge loops of areas that will be set as sharp, and then you go Control E, mark sharp, and I'll just continue doing this around the whole mesh until it starts to look a little more defined. And you can emphasize the areas that are concave. You can have sharp edges on convex areas like this if they're fairly well defined, but most concave areas you're going to be wanting to put a seam there, and UV seams work well in conjunction with sharp edges. So I'll just be hunting down these areas that need to be sharpened. Just use, I'm holding down Alt and Shift as I select to get edge loops where they exist. Sometimes Blender doesn't recognize them, and you just have to select them manually. Mark those as sharp. And all of these fins, they can be sharp as well. I've just decided that the ends of the fins, they probably don't need to be sharp because the baking will take care of them. You'll sort of develop an intuition as you do this more often of what works with normal matte baking and what doesn't. And then we have the end where it attaches to the pulley, and this is all sharp, of course, because it's basically a 90-degree angle. Looks like we've got an accidental sharp edge there, so we'll just clear it. Mark that as sharp. And I think all that's left now is the end. The end of the supercharger on the opposite side from the pulley. And just start with all these concave areas, these creases in the mesh. And then afterwards we can assess whether the convex edges need to be sharpened as well. I've just noticed a bit of messy geometry here where I didn't get rid of these additional vertices created by the bevel operation, so I'll sort them out right now, merge them. Okay, now just look around the mesh, check that everything looks reasonable. Just imagine that you're looking at it from the perspective of an in-game view, where you're looking down into the engine bay, and let's just compare it with the original mesh. Make sure nothing looks wildly different. It looks basically the same, only a slightly different silhouette. And that means it's basically ready to start UV unwrapping and then baking.